Hello, my name is Bruce Snell, and we're here to talk about today Part 1, Class 3 in our ABS certificate program. And what we're going to be covering today is the breaking through the lack of written procedure. So everyone has some handout materials. If you'll kind of turn to page 1. And what here, again, as we're saying in all these classes, we want us to remember and think and pull these classes together for this awareness of the understanding to the 4 barriers to quality. So if you look at this, everything that we talked about in the last classes are going to apply or going to have some connection here. And as we get through this, again, you're going to see the connecting from one part to the other and how we can't attack one barrier without attacking the other 3. If you look at it on page 1, we're looking at our executive summary. And our executive summary, as we move through different organizations, the same problems appear consistently. 98% of the problems of the organization fall into the 4 barriers to quality. Now this was something that as we were going through these companies, it was kind of interesting that we thought our company that we were at were the only ones that had problems until I started going to different companies. And then it was, the comment was always, is that my situation is unique, my business is different, my industry is different. And what we saw is that all these organizations not only experienced the same 4 barriers to quality, but they also addressed all of the issues that we were talking about here today. The funny thing is that each organization believed their problem to be unique. The most of the organizations experience all these 4 barriers to quality. The degree to which your organization is impacted by the barriers will affect how easily they are broken down. Number 1 is fear of expression or action. Number 2 is lack of communication, verbal, written. Number 3 is lack of written procedure. And number 4 is lack of training. Now here's some interesting thoughts here. Is that down we're going to look at some thoughts to remember. We want to look at attacking the systems and processes, not the people or the department. This section here, this workshop 3, is really talking about procedure. We have been leading up to this, talking about the fear and the communication. And have been talking about managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring in an informal and a formal organization. Where we start formalizing this thing is through these written procedures. So as we get going, we want you to look at and not focus on the people, but focus on the process. And we don't want to beat each other up. If we've got to blame somebody, blame the 4 barriers to quality. Number 2 is that 99% of our employees are good employees and good citizens. Statistically, every organization we've gone to, this has proven out. 99% of our people are good people and want to do a good job. It's our job as an organization to give them the tools and the training to do that. Number 3, the best job definition comes from the person actually doing the work. This is again of what we call the base work center concept, as we talked earlier. If you look at the base work center concept, really how we start defining that concept and that base work center is with written procedure, and that's kind of where we're at right now. And if you look at the definition of the base work center, that's why we're saying we have to have these base skills that apply to all our employees and all departments and all jobs internally within the organization. Because remember, keep this in your mind that the best person to tell you how to do the job is the person that's doing it. We have to give them the base skills to succeed. And down at the bottom, we're like, this is kind of a little long one. It says the process systems can't be changed, corrected, improved, or defined without the direction and long-term commitment of leadership. What we're saying in just that one sentence there is that there's absolutely no way for an employee to do it in an organization where there's the 4 barriers. For the fact is that they're powerless. They might jump out and make some improvements or do some things, but it has to be and come from the direction of leadership. We have to give the leadership a tool of change or correction. Systems are the responsibility of management. And what we're talking about there, the responsibility of management, is that literally the employees cannot change the system. They cannot define it without the direction and the leadership of management. So management has to accept the responsibility of those systems and processes. Management must provide a tool for moving from an informal to a formal organization, building business infrastructure. Now what we're talking about there is that other than we had talked last time about some change and we had talked about chaos and we had talked about all this, we're saying that we have to be able to go through the organization, lead our employees, give them the tools, give them the base skills, and the only way this is going to happen is for management to do it. I think even up now, even though we're up in here only 3 classes, I think you're going to see what we have meant by these base skills. Remember, when we first got started, a lot of folks were saying base skills, well, that's for the folks down lower in the organization. No, these base skills are needed at all levels throughout the organization because these are transferable skills to build that business infrastructure. Okay, and I want you to keep the connection of everything that we're laying out here. Okay, let's look at basically on page 2, we're looking at what is a system. Now, I told y'all when I first got started in this quality stuff, I heard different definitions of what a system and what a process, and I'd ask these people and I'd get different interpretation. So we ended up just writing our own stuff. And so if you look at a system is the way that we do everything internally within the organization. And the office worker is processing the paperwork, the delivery, or the pickup, or the sales of the product and service. The system cannot be corrected or improved without first being defined by everyone involved. What we're saying there is that whether you're manufacturing a product or service, you're processing, supporting some part of that product or service. That's really what we're doing, the order, the request, and we're all processing some part of it or supporting with our product and service of the organization. And what we're saying here is that the system cannot be corrected or improved. There's absolutely no way long-term that we can improve a system without everybody that's involved in it. Going back to the reason why, the best person to tell you how to do the job is the person doing it. So that's where we're talking about. We're breaking these systems up into processes, connecting them by internal supplier and customer that are now creating the systems. So it's very important to understand what we're talking about, the systems and the processes and the base work centers, especially in this section with defining procedure, because this is where all this stuff starts coming in. This starts becoming some of this tangible stuff. Because up to now we've talked about fear and communication. So now let's look at the next line item issue here. It says, from a systems approach, you're either selling a product or service or both. And most organizations have a combination of both product, service with which to deal. From government to education, it's all the same. So if you're looking at it, really most of our organizations reflect and have a part of, we're either manufacturing, processing, or delivering product or service. And everyone in the organization, no matter what organization you're in, what industry, it's all the same stuff. Everybody in the company is there to support our, if you want to look at it, our sale or our product or our service. And it says problems the most organizations have with external suppliers and customers are due to lack of systems internally. If you look at it, where do most of the problems happen? It's usually something that we've done internal to aggravate our external customer. Now y'all think about that. It says that if you really think about, our customer just doesn't leave for the heck of it. Our customer just, there's something that we've done internally. You remember the other day we talked about that 67% leave because of something we've done internally to make them angry and they leave. If you look at this, the systems, the reason it's probably going sideways is because we haven't defined the systems internally within the organization. If we do have the systems, there's more than likely fear and there's lack of communication, and there might not have been any training. Look at current issues out there today. Look at all the things that are happening where they have gone through certification, they've gone through this or that, and if there's fear in an organization, even if you have written procedure, if there's fear, how good is that written procedure? This again is what we're talking about, how they're dependent on one another. And right now, let's look at what is a base work center. A base work center is the foundation of your job, the center of your job, the focus of the activity. Each job has processes and steps, with the processes linked internally by the supplier and customer who make up the systems, okay? Remember what we talked about here. We're saying that internally within the organization has a lot of systems. When you look at it as a whole, it's very complex and hard to get your arms around. That's why most of us never change or define. What we're saying is this base work center concept is literally pulling the organization apart by base work centers, that we start separating the processes in those systems. So again, what we're saying, by linking those base work centers by internal, customer, and supplier, create the systems. The base work centers are also looking at their process, step, and procedure along with their additional duties, daily, weekly, monthly, and as needed. And we'll cover that a little more in detail a little ways down the road. So if you look at, again, that's why the base skills are so important. For the fact is that if we're going to move an organization from informal to formal and create this or hold these 4 barriers to quality accountable, those base skills have to be learned by everybody internally within the organization. And if you look at the goal, quality that can be defined, managed, planned, scheduled, and monitored, and continuously improved. The equality of people through process. And again, what we're talking about there, where inequality or unjust actions come from is that you're dealing with emotion and you're dealing with people. And when there's not a system in place, that's where the inequality comes from. So by creating those base skills, defining those base work centers, getting everybody involved in it, what we have done now is started creating equality of people through process. Now that's a concept I'd like for y'all to think on in a while. So again, by defining the systems, the written procedures, we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the base work centers, then in turn managing the organization. So that's kind of what is a system and what is a base work center. Now I'd like for you to go to page number 3 and the base work center concept. Again, we're going to get to base work center a little more in depth down the road, but right now we want you to understand why the base work center is so important and what it is, especially dealing with written procedure. Especially why we have to have these base skills for continuance and growth with our employees. And we call them transferable skills. They can go from one job to another. They can go from one division, one department, one product, one service. They can leave the organization, go somewhere else. Those skills will still apply no matter where they're at. If you look at the platinum rule, what we call the platinum rule, your base work center process and steps doesn't suffer at the expense of your additional duties. Okay, now what we're talking about there is that, remember I told you how we got started with a company that we were kind of had some cash flow problems. In that, we looked at these operators internally within the organization that I think to kind of explain it is that they were kind of getting directions from one manager sometimes, and then they were getting directions from another manager, and we had 2 operators kind of doing the same job, and then whether they did it or not, they ended up getting in trouble depending on who they were talking to or who they were working for or who they were getting their direction from that day. So what we did is that we stepped back and said the platinum rule is your base work center. Come heck or high water, you're held accountable for this. That helped clear up, because all of us in the organization, how many of us only do one thing? No, we do a lot of different things, but the problem is that as we were going through there and in the organization, we ended up doing these things and our base work center was suffering. So by defining it and getting a sign-off by everyone through the organization, the base work center process and steps, the platinum rule says that we have to do our job, our base work center. Everything outside of that, even though it's a part of your additional duty, is daily, weekly, monthly, and as needed, and priorities of that base work center. What happens is that usually that base work center additional duty is somebody else's base work center. So what we're talking about there, again, who is the best person to define the job? The person doing the job. So this way we get the whole organization focusing in on their job. Remember, people know how to do their job. So then, by doing that, everyone focusing in their area of expertise and control, we start bringing it together so we have the organization and base work centers defined by the people that are doing the job. Okay, let's look at item number 1 down there. It says base work center, a team member's area of expertise and control your job, the center, the foundation, the base of your job. Your accountability is to your base work center process and steps. That's just exactly what we talked about a minute ago. Your area of expertise and control. And I know a lot of us have been in where they send in consultants, all of a sudden they're telling us what we're doing, what we're not doing, what we're doing good, and what we're not doing good. What we're saying is we got to give our people the support and give them the tools. They know how to do their job. All we have to do is give them a chance for success. 2 is base work center additional duties. If you look at additional duties are duties added to your base work center that expand your responsibilities beyond your base work center. So if you look at that, the additional duties are those things outside your day-to-day, what you're there to do. So your additional duties take secondary to your primary, which is your base work center process and steps. So additional duties are everything else out there, and that when you start adding this, that starts bringing accountability to everyone. Remember, our employees want accountability. The only ones that don't want accountability are the 1%. So, and they're going to be the boys that are going to be screaming the loudest when this thing starts tightening up internally within the organization. If you look at number 3, base work center process, steps, and procedures. Process. We want to make sure everybody understands an agreement upon method of doing your job involved in a number of steps. Steps, an agreed upon process linked together with logical steps to do the job. Procedure, the agreed upon method of how to do each of those steps of that process. How many here have gone through flow charting? We've all gone through flow charting. We created that process and steps form, which you'll see later on in the class, is that we couldn't write all that stuff in those little bitty boxes, those flow charts. So we kind of made it like this, and all they do is write in there. So that's their process, which is their base work center, the steps, and then we have the procedures for those steps. Then everything outside is additional duties, daily, weekly, monthly, and as needed. Example, a work order or a purchase order. Most of us have a purchase order internally within an organization. That would be an additional duty. Is it important for us to have input on that? Yes, because that affects us. Is it important for us to know how to fill out a purchase order? Even though we hear from accountant, most of the time we don't know how to fill out a purchase order. And what we're saying, that could be an additional duty. Here again, the base work center is your job, your area of expertise, your control. So we want us all focusing internally at our job. Organization systems, processes linked together by internal supplier and customer. Really what we're saying there, remember the base work center are those processes. We're linking them together by internal suppliers. It's who we give our work to, we receive it, we do our process, then we pass it on to our internal customer. In our organization, what we say is that you can stop quality dead in its tracks. We don't accept or pass on non-quality. When we're catching quality out at the end in a final inspection, or the customer's catching it, it's already cost us a ton of money. We're saying by us agreeing on our base work centers and coming to that agreement, I know what I expect from you, and I can't accept anything other than what we've agreed on. Remember what we talked about, the tough decisions are holding accountable what we've talked about, okay? This is where all this stuff is going. If you look at internal suppliers and customers, change depend on additional duties or work center you're performing. The base work center process and steps should remain the same. What we're saying throughout the organization, as we change and depending on where we're at in a particular process or additional duties, our internal customer and suppliers are going to change. And that could be our internal supplier and customer could literally change just from our work order or base work center or whatever. Okay, let's look at the goal. Down at the bottom, the base person to tell you is how to do the job is the person doing the job. We call that my Uncle Junior rule. He told you, he said, Bruce, the best person to tell you how to do the job is the person doing it. That's what this whole thing about. We're trying to provide those folks that are doing those jobs a system to where they can get the best out of their expertise in their job. So again, the whole philosophy of all this stuff is to give our people the base skills to define their jobs that in turn define the organization by processes linked together to create the systems. And then again, when they have these skills, they can continuously improve them. That all sounds good. Look at all the certification programs that y'all are going through right now out there. All these things are great. They sound good. We have a ton of folks that are out there and they're certified. But where do you go from there? I can have certification and I can have total quality. I can have whatever you want to call it out there. But if there's fear, how good is that written procedure? If there's no communication and fear, how good is that written procedure? We have day after day in the paper, we see where a problem, where that organization is documented, but I know it's because of the fear and the lack of communication is why that issue didn't get brought up. Now there's issues that evolve over these last 30 or 40 years that are now costing these companies big dollars and millions of dollars. And that's what's interesting, is that we can't afford training, but we can afford to redo it or repay it or whatever. That's where we're saying we need to look at, make training a line item budget. I even go to some larger companies, they don't even have a budget for training. So we have to make that a part of how we're doing business. Now let's look at page number 4, which is the Base Work Center concept continue, the Base Work Center startup process of office and management. Now this is really an interesting one, and as we're going into companies, the managers are really the toughest ones there is to define, because as we go into these companies, most of the management has evolved through the organization, like we said the other day, because they're problem solvers. They've been able to delegate down, get things done, fix them, put them back together. They keep doing these things, and all of a sudden we make a manager out of them. Then what we do is that we don't give them a system. So now they're sitting there trying to figure out what in the world is that this office manager or this office person does. So we're saying an office-based work center, the base work center usually revolves around processing the organization's product and service. This includes answering phone calls, taking order requests, processing reports, assisting your facilitator manager, data entry, special events, putting out fires. Has anybody here ever put out fires? And then we're looking at budget processing, replying to internet or internal, external requests, and or reacting daily to current events and actions. So the office-based work center is what we're saying here, is really kind of orchestrating and supporting all this activity of our product and service internally within the organization. And they're usually supporting management. So as an office environment, it's not like it's a clear-cut process, but you'll learn later how we define that. And that is really logging and taking in all those things that we're processing daily, from answering phone calls to writing or pulling up basically month-end reports, quarterly reports, week reports, or whatever it is. Number 2 is the management-based work center. If you look at the management-based work center, it says this base work center is usually the hardest to find because most management has evolved as good firefighters and problem solvers with little formal training and or information systems to manage. The management usually has a lot of the same involvement with the base work centers. Kind of got mixed up on that one. So if you look at it, the office manager is really, what is it that we're here to do as the manager? The manager is to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the organization. The office-based work center is really there to support and process mainly the paperwork and the coordination of all these things that are happening. And if I'm an office worker for a manager, I'm usually compiling the data and the information that's coming in. So if you look at this, the leadership's goal, the leadership through Base Work Systems 2000 must help define the systems to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the organization's people and process. A suggested system to start with is what we're saying here is that this is what we need to start in the organization, is look at those systems from management, how in the world we're going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. Because look at it, what are we there to do as managers? We got to manage the folks, what we call reporting-based work centers. And what are our reporting-based work centers doing? Our reporting-based work centers are processing or supporting some part of that order request. Now let's look at the management of the systems. Listed below are some suggestions on getting your arms around your office manager based work center. Okay, if you look at that chart or that graph down there, it says base work center questions. It says up at the top, we kind of put this stuff, and we've talked about it over the last few classes and stuff, is that we want to look at these base work center questions. As a manager, not only as a manager, but as an office employee, the ones that are internally processing and supporting these order requests. Because if you look at that, that's really a kind of a good check sheet for you to kind of do an accounting of what in the world that you're doing. We're asking, again, you're going to hear this. Up at the top it says order request. Okay, how do I manage, plan, schedule, and monitor and budget that order request? Remember, order is external, request is internal. That is, I need something from your department, your division, or whatever. That is what we're calling an internal request. Order is external. Now we're looking at, on down the line, how are we going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the manpower, machine, materials, and methods, and the budget? So if you look at this from a manager, we need to be looking at how are we giving that direction to the reporting-based work centers in our division or our department. These are the key questions that we have to go over and ask ourselves to help define our base work center. Our closing thoughts, office, ask what I was hired to do, the most important. It's really interesting, these closing thoughts. When we go, well, what were you hired to do? It gets down to the point that we can't describe what we do because we kind of literally do everything. We just go, hey, what were you hired to do? And what you're going to see is that job's evolved to where it might have been focused here, has now become this. And we're no longer really doing what we were hired to do. And look at the management. Develop the systems to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the 4M. So for management, that's what y'all need to focus on. And watch out for the request not written overload. Now this is interesting because when I get in there, especially in an office environment, everybody, we have what we call, and we'll go over this later in one of our later workshops or classes, what we're saying is that really you're processing internal requests, the majority of the office workers. We're processing or supporting that order request. We're saying log that information and log those things that you're doing, and also too try to sort through and get an idea of weekly, quarterly, weekend, day in, or whatever reports that starts lining out your base work center. And most of the office and support people are so overloaded because they're all kind of maybe doing redundant work, and or people are dumping things on them that they don't need to be doing. And believe it or not, it actually exists out there in some organizations that some managers or co-workers start ditching out their work, and all of a sudden that person's workload, especially if they're a good hard worker, they have a tendency to keep taking on. They keep doing more, and we keep giving it to them because they're completing it. Pretty soon they're sitting in the room and they're all burnt out, and they're going, what in the world am I doing? I never got here to do this thing. So what has happened, we've overloaded that person. Now all of a sudden we're burning them out. And people I have seen, even when they downsize outsource, will last at a huge overload for about 18 months, and they start burning out and shutting down. So if you'll look at this, let's look at page number 5. Page number 5 is where we're going to be getting into breaking through the lack of written procedure. And what we're going to do, again, Remember, when we get started in these 4 barriers, we want to look at what do these 4 barriers look like. See, that's what's so important, is that we want to be able to identify what these barriers look like. Okay, so we're saying the product of lack of written procedure. We're going, okay, what do these things look like? We're going, this thing, the written procedure, is an informal organization. It'd be interesting to hear how many times that we're going to talk about an informal organization, how many times we're going to talk about the 4 barriers, how many times we're going to talk about the base values. What you're going to see is how key these things are and these base skills. An informal organization. When you do not have written procedure, now this is going to start bringing a little better understanding of what we're talking about an informal organization. We're looking at when you don't have written procedure, you have an informal organization. So literally, by Base Work Center, you've got an informal process that's tied together with an internal supplier and customer that's tied together to make up an informal system. So in a sense, you have an informal organization. Okay, that's the part of what we're talking about, an informal and the lack of written procedure. Okay, poor training for the job. That's our next one. I love this stuff they talk about. We got to cross-train. Have y'all been through that yet? It's interesting. I go, man, we haven't even defined how we're doing our job, much less been trained on our job. How in the world are we going to cross-train? Cross-train is not running over and standing over looking at somebody trying to figure out how they're doing their job. Cross-training is actually having a process, step, and procedure in a formal training program. So we're saying here, poor training for the job. If you don't have written procedure, you know how most of us train? Yo, follow me around. Let's go out there and look through the plant. Let's look through the office. Okay, we'll go out and try to make a sale. Just follow me and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, here's our month end. Just wait till month end and then kind of work through it with me, and then all of a sudden we throw you to the wolves. Or we put out there in that training program, we're going to train you, but first get out there and make it happen. Then they're going, if I follow you around for 6 weeks, how productive do you think that is? How much does that cost? But on the other hand, I can't afford to do training. See how we're defeating ourselves in the organization. And well, I kind of got into number 2 when we talk about how can we cross-train. If you look at it, again, without written procedure, there's absolutely no way to cross-train. Then we're looking at inventory capacity and lead time. Whoa, now that's a tough one. If you look at inventory capacity and lead time, is that without written procedure, how and where do you know when to order? Who do you know where to order it from? And how do you know and where do you know that the lead times are? So if you look at it, okay, we got the deal, we're running through the plant, we're all happy, the front office is just happy, we're processing all the orders, we're doing billing, and then all of a sudden we realize we can't get the part's on hold. So now we're sitting here trying to figure out, are the R&D department or the engineering department is so overloaded we can't get to it for a year. So if you look at that without written procedure, how in the world can we control our inventories and capacities? And the capacities can be from the front office. I can only work and process so much stuff every day. And then if we don't have the lead time or that written procedure on those particular products, every organization has lead times. Every organization, somebody knows that, hey, we should have ordered that thing like 3 or 4 weeks ago. But when it gets down to it, we're all waiting on it to come through the door and it's not there. Next is processing capacity. Here we're talking about the 4 M's, the manpower, machine, materials, and methods. Without written procedure again and the processing, how in the world do we know the capacities of the 4 M's? And not only that, if their base work centers aren't defined, how good are those capacity numbers that we're claiming to have that we can produce? Okay, you look at number 6. It says you can't improve until you define. Now, we've talked about that one about 2 billion times already. I really want to go over that because that's really important. If you look at it, you can't improve until you define. What we do in most of these things, we send people out to these training or these classes, and we're going to do process improvement, or we're going to do systems improvement, or process mapping, or we're going to do continuous improvement. And it's really interesting. That's what I said the other day. I said, how in the world are we going to re-engineer when we haven't even engineered to begin with? We haven't even defined how in the world that we're doing business. So if you look at this, it says you can't improve until you define. So by defining that job or that procedure or that system or that process, you improve it. How does that happen? Remember, everybody that is involved in that process, that step, that procedure has to be involved in writing that procedure. So believe me, time you get 4 or 5 folks together agreeing on something, they're going to improve the way that thing's, basically they're going to improve the way that product or service is being processed. So if you look at that, by getting all of us to define it and put it into a written procedure, we have just improved the system. Now think about that. By putting it in writing, we've improved it. Because again, without written procedure or without it defined, how are we going to improve it? There ain't nothing to improve other than walk around and beat the heck out of each other. There ain't no way to do it. Remember, some days we hit it, some days we don't hit it. Okay, and then we're saying bad data. Now that's another interesting one, and we even have some stuff on statistical process control and all that a little later on. But bad data without written procedure, we're saying that it's a hit and a miss. This thing without a written procedure, it is a hit and a miss, meaning that the bad data that we're collecting, or the data that we're collecting because it's not a defined system, is erratic. It's like this. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. We cannot trust that data. We don't even know if we're collecting the data the same way. It was absolutely amazing. We would go to some of our other offices in the organizations that we were in, and what we were calling one line item issue, they were calling it another. Their numbers didn't even reflect how in the world the organization was doing business or that data. Let's look at number 8, process and systems interpretation. Now this is another interesting one here. Without written procedure, you look at this, the process. Remember, most of the processes start with our base work centers, our process steps and procedures. If we don't have written procedures, we have process and systems interpretation. Why do we have systems interpretation? Remember, linking the processes together make up the systems. So if they're not defined processes, the systems aren't going to be defined without written procedure. Bad statistical process control. This is what we were talking about a little earlier here, is that if you look at without a written procedure, no matter what data, what information you're collecting about that processing or supporting of that order request is going to be no good. You might as well throw it out. Because again, it's out of spec, or what we call out of control here, meaning it's not in a controlled state. It's hitting here. There's no written process, so there's no way to go back in and tweak it. It's kind of like each time, we call it a new day every day, as what we talked about a little earlier. We haven't learned anything, and without no written procedure, it's absolutely no way to do statistical process control anywhere in the organization. No continuous improvement. Now this is another one, it's kind of like that re-engineering stuff. We've asked, how in the world can you re-engineer when you ain't even engineered what you're doing? We're saying, how can you continuously improve without you've even improved, or you haven't even defined what you're doing? So this is the same thought process. If we don't have written procedure, how in the world can we continuously improve? Tell me what you're going to continuously improve. Nothing. You're going to get out there and try to make things happen. If we don't spend the time, energy, and effort, no matter what we do internally within that organization is going to be short-lived. So if you look at that, though, no continuous improvement, you can go out there and do all that stuff you want to. Without written procedure, it's no good. Because again, it's not in basically a stable condition, that process. The data that we're trying to make decisions off of to improve it is no good because it's a hit and a miss. And so if you look at the continuous improvement, you can draw all those charts and stuff up on the wall and collect data, but it ain't going to be any good. And look at putting out the fires, number 11. if you look at without written procedure, think of what we do. I want everybody here to think about what in the world that we're doing. Most of the time in the morning, we get started wondering what in the world went bad overnight, what orders that we got in that we can't process. I don't know about y'all, but sometimes every once in a while we have employees that don't show up for work. I don't know if that's ever created a problem for anybody. Or we had a piece of equipment go down. Or we launched a new product. This is another interesting thing. We launch a new product, then we don't even give training on the people on how to support it. It's interesting. My parents bought a new faucet, some set of faucets for their new house there. And they were kind of a high dollar in, and it was amazing. And they said they used to have support tech people out in the field. And what was interesting, they took them all out, all the support people, and they gave an 800 number for customer service. And we got a story about this customer service stuff. So they gave us an 800 number, and my parents were trying to get their house going. And I'm talking to my mama, and she goes, Bruce, they don't have the washer for this thing. So we've been without a sink for like 3 weeks. They don't know when they're getting the washer in. And I said, well, Mom, don't they have a rat? And she goes, well, what they're telling us is to call this 800 number. And I said, well, have you called it? She goes, I've been calling for 3 weeks. I go, 3 weeks? I said, well, what? She goes, I can't even get in. The phone line's busy. I said, you're kidding. I said, all right. I said, I'm curious on what's happened. So I got the name of the company, and I won't divulge it here because it's not important. But I called them, and they happened to be out there in California. And I called them, and I got to the main switchboard. I said, can you hand me the production manager? Believe me, the production manager, operation managers know everything that's going on in the company. They're usually the ones that end up catching up with all this inefficiency stuff and the problems. So I get this guy, we go through the phone, and here he is. And I said, hey, we need a washer and this and that. He goes, oh, Bruce, we can have that on the truck here tomorrow. I said, I'm curious about your 800 number. He goes, man, what a mess that is. I go, what? He says they all sat down and brainstormed and strategically planned about getting this 800 number to cut cost with our reps out in the field. And what happened was, it was a great idea, and I still believe it is, so they put it into play, and they had like one person answering the phone. I go, you're kidding. He said they didn't even go through and figure out how they were going to answer those calls. So in turn, it shut that whole system down. So if you look at it, we spend so much time, we spend probably 80 or 90% of the time in a strategic plan or management session figuring out, let's say, this 800 number, but we actually spend less than 10% to 15% on how in the world we're going to implement it. Now think about that. We're spending all the time, energy, and effort on the marketing of it and what that product is, but we spend almost no time at all on how we're going to support it, the process, the steps, the procedure, how we're going to take those calls in. So that's a perfect example out there of non-quality. Is that, yeah, it sounded good, looked good, everybody was supportive. So anyway, long story short, the guy actually took, now this is how most of our people are. They're good people. He took the thing home with him, and he mailed it on his way home from work that night, and my mama got that thing the next day. She goes, oh, I don't know how you did that, but man, we sure appreciate it. We can use the same. That's another perfect example of how our employees internally will go the extra mile for us. All we have to do is give them the chance and the opportunity. So if you look at putting out these fires, most of the time without the written procedure, all we're doing is moving literally from one fire to the next. And again, if we're saying without written procedure and the 4 barriers, how are you going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor? Okay, if you look at this, let's go to number 12. And I made that one up myself there. It's called Reactive Seat of the Pants, Running of the Business, Crisis Management. I don't know if any of that or even half of that might fit where some of you guys have worked at or are currently working at or at the other company. But if you look at it, reactive seat of the pants management. How in the world are you going to manage an organization when there's no written procedure? look at it. You can go in there. If we do have, and we've been into some organizations that have these generic things that are mandated by the federal government or their industry or whatever, but they're very generic policies. We call them dust collecting manuals that are really about this thick here. And what they do is that they give you every vague, any indication of anything out there, but doesn't tell you how to do it. So if you look at this, without the written procedure, we're really going on a crisis management. We're basically reacting to the events and actions. So without written procedure, we're actually just always behind. Again, I don't know how many of y'all are able to just turn the light out and go home after 6 or 7, 8 hours a day. Most can't, and especially most of the managers and most of our owners of these organizations can't, because there's not written procedure. Remember, we said that how are you going to delegate? How are you going to delegate down? You can't until you have written procedure. And so then it becomes a hands-on. Then, see, we start in that loop again. And then if there's fear and there's no written procedure, what you're going to see is that how in the world are you going to agree or resolve anything? If there's fear and there's no communication, you have written procedure, you can't get written procedure. But now, with the fear gone, I can hold that written procedure accountable. Remember, we've had to agree on it. We've had to come to an agreement what I expect or accept from you. So if you look at no accountability, again, this is really big time, and this is what I was telling y'all before. This is the thing that I don't really like about they're sending our employees to these accountability classes, and they're sending out all these seminars that are saying, hey, how to make your employees accountable, how to make them responsible, how to make them this and that. Our employees want to be accountable. It's the 4 barriers that prevent them. And then we're asking that without written procedure, how in the world can you be accountable? You can't. There's absolutely no, or the accountability or responsibility of convenience, what we talked about before. So if you look at that, the no accountability, with no written procedure, there's absolutely no accountability. Our next one is no ownership of job or base work center responsibility. I'm going to ask you this, is that how in the world can you own something that ain't defined? Think about that one. Hey, take ownership. Take the responsibility. Take the accountability. Get in there and get involved. Treat it as your own. How can you do that when you have absolutely no written procedure? So how in the world am I going to have ownership of my job? You can't. So if you look at this, we're saying there's absolutely no accountability, you have no ownership of your job, and all of a sudden now we're just kind of processing whatever happens to come around, and there's no way for me to improve it. Again, look at no ownership, no responsibility. If there's fear in the organization, no communication, I've had no training, how in the world are we going to be responsible? And it looks at no monitoring. That's when there's no written procedure, how in the world can you monitor? What is there to monitor? You know how we monitor? We run around from one base work center to the next. Hey, are you finished? We're saying here with no written procedure, you can't monitor. How in the world can you monitor? You can't. It's impossible. So if you're looking at the no monitoring, and we're looking at our base work centers, everything we've talked about here about the base work center and the accountability and the monitoring and the planning and the scheduling, I'm going to say it again, is that that's why we have to have these base skills for our employees. They have to, because what we again talked about, breaking the whole organization down by systems, systems by processes and steps and procedure, by those people doing those jobs. So if you look at it, that's really, again, what we're talking about. That tells you why we have to have these base skills. Because the organization, the man at the top, the boss, can't do it himself. If we're going to have continuance and growth, we have to have these base skills and get all our people going in the same direction, in the same page, under the same terms and conditions. Our people want to do good. It's our responsibility. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and we're going to finish up this thing. So what I want you to do is to think about this written procedure. We want to think about the impact that lack of written procedure has and the other barriers, how they affect it. So we'll see you here after the break. Thanks. Think about it.